Hello, welcome to Programming Tutorial 7, Camera and UI. Today we will be covering how to make the camera move in our code by following the player side to side. After that, we will be creating a UI for the game by showing the player's health bar on the screen after we create a health for the player. So that is actually all there is for today, so let's get started right away. Alright, so let's get started right away and hop into our Unity project. Okay, so here we are, same as last week. You guys added an obstacle last week as your submission, so yours should look a little bit different than mine. But the first thing we're actually going to do is create the first part of the Snake Man level and build it out by using blocks, so we can actually get the camera to follow the player across the level. So I'm going to quickly build out the level similar to the Snake Man level. Obviously it's not going to look exact and it's not going to be detailed and with proper sprites, but I'm going to make a general look of what the first part of the level looks like. So I will be right back and you guys should do the same. However, you don't need to make it look exactly like the Snake Man level. You can add your own little nuances to it, whatever you want, but I'm going to kind of stay true to what the game is mostly looking like. So I will be right back. Alright, so I have just finished with the level, and I actually made Mega Man. I scaled him up to 8 instead of 5, which was at before, to fit the size of the level more. But if I zoom out now, you'll be able to see the level that I built. There's this bottom area, and then you go up a ladder to get to the second area, and then up to the ladder, and this is where there's kind of like a mini boss area at the top, but we won't worry about that for now. For the ladder, I just found a ladder sprite on the internet and put it into my folder, and then I used it to make ladders up like this. And so this is the level that I created. Each block that I placed in the level is scaled evenly, so it actually fits into these squares as well. So that should be good, and it looks good. So now that we created this level, and hopefully you guys created a level as well, we can actually get the camera to follow the player. So to get the camera to actually follow the player, first is we need to create a script to edit. So if we go into our scripts folder, right click, create, C# script, and let's call it CameraMovement. Perfect. Now let it load, double click, and it should open in Visual Studio. It might take a few seconds to load. For me, it was pretty quick. So the first thing we need to do is actually put in some variables for the components we're going to need to access in this script. So the first thing we're going to need is a serialized field, and we're going to do a game object, and we're going to call it player object. And then we're going to need a transform for the camera's transform, and we are also going to need a player controller for the player controller script, which is this script, so we can access it in the camera movement script. And then once we do that, we can go into our start function, and we can do trans equals get component transform, just like we've done before. And then we can do player. This one's a little different. We're actually going to get the player object dot get component, and we're going to call player controller. Perfect. So now this trans variable has the camera's transform component stored in it, and this player variable has the player object's player controller component stored in it. So the player object is, we're actually going to put that in the Unity inspector. So let's actually do that now. We have this script saved. We go back to Unity, let it load. Perfect. We go into our main camera, and how I normally add scripts to objects is I just drag it in, but there's another way. If you click add component, you can just search up the script name and you can add it directly onto it, just like that. It's the same thing as dragging it on. It's just, if you prefer that way, you can do it that way. So now the camera has our camera movement script, and we're going to simply drag our player into this player object section. So now this serialized field has player, and that line of getComponent PlayerController is getting the player's PlayerController component because it is on the player. Perfect. So we can go back into our script and continue. So the easiest way to actually get the camera to follow the player is to just set its X position to be equal to the player's. So we can do this in one line by doing trans.position equals, and we're going to do a new vector 3, and the X value is going to be player object dot transform dot position dot X. So that's the X component because we want to follow the player's X with our camera. The Y component is just going to be trans.position.y because we don't want the Y value to move yet. And the Z value is the same thing, trans.position.z, and done. So if we go back into Unity, and let it load, and then we click play, we should have the camera following the player back and forth. Perfect. So now anytime the player moves, the camera is also going to move with it. And this is very strict and stiff, and the camera doesn't really look very good, and it doesn't feel like the player has a lot of freedom to move around with the camera. So that's why this is kind of an easy way of doing it and in one line, because it's not my favorite way of doing it. So I'm going to improve this and make the camera feel and look a little bit better. So if we exit play mode, we can go back into our scripts and we can fix this up. Alright, so my way of making this better is we can fully just get rid of this line completely, and we're going to make two if statements. So in the first if statement, we're going to say if player object dot transform dot position dot X minus trans dot position dot X is greater than 3, and then in there we are going to do trans dot position plus equals transform dot right times time dot delta time times player dot get speed, just like this. So for now, this is going to give you a red squiggle and give you an error. That is because we technically haven't created the GetSpeed function yet, but we will do that right after this. Basically what the GetSpeed function is it gives us the player's current speed, because the player has its own speed value, and we want to be able to access that in CameraMovement. So we can't just write player.speed because it's player's value, not the camera's value. So in here, in our PlayerController, if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, we can create a new function, public float GetSpeed, and then in here we're just going to return speed. And that's all we need to do. Make sure it's public, because if it is not public, then CameraMovement will not be able to access it. So we have a public float GetSpeed that returns the player's speed. Perfect. So now the red squiggle is gone. And then under this if statement, we're going to do another if statement. It's going to be similar but not exactly the same. So we're going to do player object dot transform dot position dot X minus trans dot position dot X is less than -3, and we're going to copy this line, and instead of plus equals, we're going to make it minus equals. So what this is doing is it's checking if the player is either 3 units ahead of the camera in the right side or 3 units behind the camera on the left side. Then the camera will start following the player at the same speed that the player is moving. So that's why we need the player.getSpeed, because we want the camera to move at the exact same speed as the player is moving, so it doesn't go any slower or faster than the player, so it's consistent. So we move the camera in pretty much the exact same way we move the player. So if we go back to our player and look how we did our walk function, it's the exact same. It's transform.right times time.delta time times speed, and here transform.right time.delta time and speed. So it's the exact same way of moving the player. It only has a check to see when it should be moving. So if we save that and go back into our game, and then once it loads, we click play. Perfect. Now, if we move a little bit, the camera won't follow us. But if once we get to a certain point, the camera will start to follow. And in my opinion, this just looks way better to play with. It feels a lot better. It's a lot smoother, and you feel more freedom when you're playing the game, when you have the ability to move a little bit before the camera follows you. And so that is how you make the camera follow your player from side to side. Awesome, so let's exit play mode. So I'm going to end this video here, and then in the next one we will be doing the UI with the health bar. I just don't want one video to be too long. They are, again, still part of the same tutorial, so you should be watching both of them. But if you didn't want to watch so much at one time, that is why I'm splitting it. So I'm going to end this one here, and I will be back in the next one to do the UI video.